Chapter 7 is our chapter on inequality, but this time with a focus on women and femininity. Because this is the companion corresponding chapter to the inequality chapter with a focus on men and masculinity, the question that the chapter is organized around or organized to set up to address is the same question as we had in the previous chapter, which is if both men and women are constrained by a binary gender system, why is it that more women than men find this system unfair? So in the previous chapter, we addressed that question from the stance of masculinity. What is it about masculinity and the perception of men in society that contributes to this binary system, but a binary system that men are less likely to find unfair than women. And now we're going to address the other half of that by discussing how society defines and perceives femininity and how that contributes to this question, or to the context this question is based upon. So this chapter begins with the same example as the last chapter did, which is, that cheerleading, because last chapter focused on the fact that cheerleading used to be a sport associated more closely with men, and now it's an example of activity, a sport that has been feminized, that if you were to look at it through those gender binary glasses, you would probably define it as being feminine. And as we discussed last time, it was given as an example of something that experienced male flight. And once men left it and in large numbers and droves, and it became demasculinized, in a lot of ways it became devalued. It went from emphasizing the leader part of cheerleader to emphasizing maybe the cheer part more, and the idea that cheerleaders were just auxiliaries to the primary athletic teams, and mostly on the sidelines to be cute and peppy. That was and those are the types of characteristics that men should not aspire to be, and so thus men are now for the most part no longer cheerleaders. So that they took us up through that part of the history. Now we start this chapter with a return to cheerleading and the observation that in the last decade or two we've seen cheerleading be remasculinized, but not by the return of men in large numbers, but by the women themselves. That female cheerleaders are adding athleticism and increasingly dangerous stunts to cheer routines, stunts that require not just grace, but athleticism and raw muscular strength. And thus cheerleading has become a much more dangerous activity, as evidenced by injury and concussion rates. And that, especially for high school and college teams that want to compete in those big competitions and the types of stunts that are needed, they do recruit men, to be on the team, and that for a lot of these men, these recruitment appeals are being couched in language meant to appeal to that hegemonic masculine ideal, being strong, being muscular, being around, being able to be around pretty women, right? That these are the types of messages often found in recruitment material for male cheerleaders. But at the same time, it's been remasculinized. It still has maintained this distinctly feminine dimension. Certainly, one example of how it does that you can kind of just see by, the Dallas Cowboy cheerleader uniform, right? The sexy outfits, which have become sexier and more minimal, in the past few decades. In a lot of ways, for a lot of people, it's still defined as a feminine auxiliary to sport as opposed to being a sport itself. Your book mentions that less than half of U.S. high school athletic associations define it as a sport. Neither does the U.S. Department of Education or the National Collegiate Athletic Association. Instead, they define it as an activity, as if it was chess club or band, despite those high injury and concussion rates. And then finally, the textbook mentions how there's a performative aspect to cheerleading. You know, the fact that you're doing these stunts, these potentially dangerous stunts, but you have this smile on your face. You have to maintain a certain type of friendly, approachable air playing to the crowd. And they were like, you know, this kind of flies in the face of a lot of the performative aspects around a lot of other sports where the focus is on being aggressive, on being dominant, perhaps even being scary. And so they end the discussion of this example with this great quote: cheerleading is somehow simultaneously masculine and feminine, hardcore and cute, athletic and aesthetic, admired and belittled. It is, in other words, very much like being a woman, what being a woman can feel like today. And that's on page 161. And so that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of this for a lot of this video is, you know, why are women in this kind of precarious position where, you know, femininity has all these competing expectations and perceptions, and there's a real balancing act in terms of how do you do it in such a way that you are admired and not attacked, because it is less straightforward than a discussion of hegemonic masculinity. And we're going to talk about why it's more complicated than that here in a second. And so, well, you know, we start off by noting that women have more freedom than men. They have more behavioral freedom in the sense that they can enjoy both masculine and feminine aspects of life, something that largely men don't, or they do at the risk of gender policing, or they do, but they, you know, have to make sure they provide a really good account as to why. And for the most part, women don't have that, you know, and last chapter talked about this. They talked about how with the concept of androcentrism, masculinity is afforded more respect than femininity in most spaces. And this begins in childhood. You know, just think back to that distinction between, you know, calling a girl a tomboy versus calling a boy a sissy, and why they aren't the same level of disrespect. And that is because, as androcentrism states, there are positive aspects to masculinity. It's admirable. So when a woman does it, it's admirable. But femininity, particularly femininity being done by a man or a boy, it becomes less admirable in almost all spaces. And so in this way, women do have that behavioral freedom where they can take on some masculine aspects. They can compete in masculine activities. They can consume masculine media, and they do that usually with less risk of being gender policed as stringently as men do. But there is a caveat, there is a catch. A woman can be too masculine. And so your book makes this point, you know, womanly women versus manly men. The model woman is both feminine and masculine. The ideal is a balance. And so a woman who wants to do masculinity has to balance it with femininity, because if she does not, she will be policed for overdoing masculinity. Before we get more into that, let me go back to my little graph over here, because this is the research that they were quoting. So it shows that there is a lot more admiration for manly men than there are for womanly women during the time this poll was conducted, which was 2017. And womanly women are more likely to be looked down upon than manly men are. And that just kind of demonstrates their point that, you know, today's contemporary ideal for women is someone that has a mix of these feminine and masculine traits. It's not so much that the ideal is for a woman to be manly across the board, but the idea is that she has found a way to balance her femininity with some aspects of masculinity. And so the key there is balance. And your book talks about this, by discussing the feminine apologetic, as well as what they call the modern Barbie rule. So, the feminine apologetic is the idea that a woman apologizes for her masculinity by adopting conventional femininity in some forms. And your book says it's almost a way to soothe others' concerns about her appropriation of masculinity. So a good example of the feminine apologetic is, Candace Parker, who is a great WNBA player. You can see when she plays, I mean, it's not like she goes on like with a full face of makeup and hair, and she's known for her play. But yet, when she was on the cover of ESPN, they could have offered her the cover at many other points in her career, but they put her on the cover when she was, I think they said 7 or 8 months pregnant with her child. And you can see the tagline, "How big can Candace Parker get?" And of course, it was meant to be tongue in cheek because, the interview is mainly talking about her career in the WNBA, but to have that tagline when someone is near to popping, about to give birth, was also a nod to her femininity, and it also subtly addressed concerns that people have about female athletes, particularly in aggressive sports that used to predominantly be played by men, that these women are overly masculine and perhaps even lesbians, because even though the homophobia is not as overt as what you see when people are talking about men doing femininity, the homophobia is still there when people are talking about women who are overdoing masculinity. So the feminine apologetic is, I'm a great basketball player. I can probably even beat a good number of you regular guys, if not NBA players in basketball, but I will make you feel better about this ability that I have by embracing my overt femininity here, which for her here is in addition to a more feminine expression, in terms of the dress, the earrings, the blown out hair, the light makeup, is the fact that she is clearly with child and about to give birth, and you don't get more feminine than that. Going along with the feminine apologetic is, the idea of what they call the modern Barbie rule. And so the modern Barbie rule is the idea that today's Barbie can be anything, but the important thing is that she looked good while doing it. Because a big part of femininity is still that focus on looking good, on being appealing, particularly to men. So you can be a surgeon, you can be a basketball player, you can be an MMA fighter, but you have to look good while doing it. And the book example that your book gave was Christmas Abbott, who apparently is a CrossFit competitor and a weightlifter. But they talk about how she upholds this kind of conventional femininity in her appearance, thus exemplifying the modern Barbie rule. Now, of course, they say, this becomes challenging when your other identities don't allow adherence to this rule. And so they particularly spoke about, women of color, particularly African-American women, but also disabled women who, because their appearance might veer so dramatically from kind of standard conventional definitions of beauty of Barbie, that they can't uphold this rule. So when they then do that masculinity, appropriate some masculine traits, then they are less protected by this Barbie rule, and they might find themselves being attacked for being overly masculine. And I think Serena Williams is a good example, because of how often she has been the victim of very cruel and racialized attacks on her appearance and supposed manliness. And of course, a lot of that is based upon, her superior performance on the tennis court, but also the fact that that superior performance on the tennis court is goes along with an appearance that isn't very Barbie-like. I mean, she isn't naturally slender. She isn't white. She doesn't have, long hair. And all of these things, by not having these things that would maybe make society, particularly men in society, feel safer about her athletic performance, because she doesn't have these things. This leaves her more open for attack. And so, I do think it's fitting that they chose to feature her quote about how there is no wrong way to be a woman, because as they note, although that is a great quote, it is aspirational, not accurate. That in our society, yes, there is in fact a wrong way to be a woman, because we even have a name for it, and we call it pariah femininities. So pariah femininities are, in short, wrong ways to be women. So who are those women, these wrong women? First of all, they're women who don't defer to men. This leaves them open to being called things like, bitch, or a ball buster, or a cunt. These are women who don't seem to care if men find them attractive. A hag. It's women who withhold sex without caring if men approve, or really women who just engage in sex by their own rules, regardless of men approving or not. And so this would be both, women that they refer to as sluts or whores, as well as women that they refer to as prudes or frigid. And then for women who do not form households with men, whether that means that they have a household on their own, they're a spinster or an old maid, or, they have a household with another woman, in which case, of course, that opens up all of the, slurs related to lesbians. So these women, they don't balance, they defy. And these types of femininities are referred to as pariah because they are stigmatizing, in the sense that you risk rejection, verbal attack, violence, ostracism by claiming them, by doing them. And it's not so much that they feel necessarily stigmatizing all the time to the person who is upholding that identity, but the fact that that identity in a lot of spaces in contemporary US society does put that woman at risk of experiencing one of those consequences: rejection, verbal attack, perhaps violence, perhaps ostracism. And so that quote on page 168, because a central feature of socially constructed womanhood is attractiveness to presumed heterosexual men, that aspect of femininity, being conventionally sexually attractive, is often a non-negotiable part of striking the right balance. And so I think your book makes a great point that when a lot of women are that have, societal approval, their balance is like, I play sports, I'm still really attractive. And so many women, post Title IX, in the 1970s, have kind of embraced playing sports. So many women are embracing being sports fans and consumers. We can track that through media consumption. That's been a masculine trait that they've appropriated. What hasn't been appropriated nearly as much is refusal to shave, being hairy. And your book says that, that's because that is the riskier choice in the balance, right? To be a woman who doesn't like sports and not play sports, but then to balance that with the masculine trait of not shaving, that is a much riskier choice than, being the attractive woman that, is great at playing soccer. And so, the next few slides is material I'm adding in addition to the textbook, because it does relate to beauty and attractiveness. Just because, as your book notes, that is still such a salient component of that femininity definition. And so I begin with introducing you to the concept of the beauty myth. And this was an idea put out by author Naomi Wolf in her book, which was entitled The Beauty Myth. And the beauty myth is just a belief in a quality called beauty that is real and universal, and that women, due to biological, sexual, and evolutionary factors, should want to embody, while men should desire the women who embody that ideal. So basically, it's the idea, the myth of beauty is the idea that it is this objective thing that just exists out there, and that is natural, as opposed to what it really is, which is, of course, socially constructed. And because it's socially constructed, that means, that it's not natural and it's not universal, because what is defined as beautiful is going to vary society, historical time period to historical time period. And so if you go back to kind of our chapter 3, like definitions about, what makes something real, the fact that it's not natural, the fact that it's not biological, the fact that it's not universal, means that it's not real. But it's promoted in our society as if it is real. And it has, according to Naomi Wolf, this is important because it does have significant consequences for the women who are expected to want to embody that ideal, who are expected to spend time, energy, and effort to embody that ideal. And, it also has, consequences for the men who are taught that they should, desire the women that have that ideal. And in this way, it kind of becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. And she emphasizes in her book that for a lot of these cultural ideals of beauty, they're unrealistic, that they're promoted as real to maintain gender differences. The idea that men and women look so different, and that women are naturally, smaller and daintier and curvier. But in reality, it is a lot of our body work, as opposed to, genetics, that contributes to that difference. And a good example of this is the Photoshop used on models. And I give you that time-lapse video, right? It makes her hair longer and more luxurious. It makes her waist thinner. It makes her breasts bigger. It makes her bum perkier. It makes her thighs thinner. That exaggerated hourglass shape, whether people are already working at having it, through dieting and flat tummy teas and waist trainers and so forth. But then the fact that now in the world of technology and social media, that people can manipulate their images to further give off, the idea that that's their real shape and their real look, that makes the beauty myth all the more dangerous. And so, just think about how you would define today's standards of beauty for women today. This is always a great conversation when we have it in class, because, these standards, because they are socially constructed, they do change over time. I have witnessed in just the time period, the 10 years I've been teaching, how these standards have changed, particularly in the rise of, reality stars like, the Kardashians, and the phenomenon of Instagram models, and everyone is walking around with pasted on eyelashes now. I can honestly say that was not what people were doing in 2006 when I think I first taught this course. So, these standards change, but what doesn't really change or hasn't really changed dramatically in our society in the last 150 years is women's relationship to these standards. One concept that kind of characterizes women's relationship to these standards is the Iron Maiden concept. And it's the idea that these standards become like an iron trap for women that they can't avoid, in the sense of, yeah, sure, you cannot do them, but because they are so well known, the standards, and they're so routinely expected, not doing them doesn't free you from the trap of not doing them. Instead, you don't wear makeup. People say things like, are you sick? You don't look well today. Or, oh, it would be nice if you dressed up. You know, if you don't do your hair, I mean, depending on where you work, there might even be, you know, some rules in the dress code about what does presentable look like for women. And oftentimes there are a lot more rules related to women's appearance and what it means to be presentable than to men. You know, going back to body hair, you know, no one's making you shave, but you know, whether it's harassment or whether it's judgment or whether it's ostracism, um, you aren't free from the expectations just because you defy them. And that's how the Iron Maiden concept works. But then at the same time, beauty standards can also be understood in our society in terms of what's called the Goldilocks dilemma. So if you remember the story of Goldilocks, right, you know, this porridge is too hot, this porridge is too cold, this bed is too hard, this bed is too soft. Well, beauty standards are the same way. Women are expected to uphold them, but they're not expected to overly obsess about them. You're expected to wear makeup, but you aren't expected to have a full face of it. This goes back to this meme that I found, or a student found, about why guys have trust issues. And it's rather mean because it's mocking the idea that, like, oh, these women look totally different without makeup, and this is, you know, they're tricking guys. But the expectation, of course, is that women wear makeup, you know, that women, you know, do care about their appearance, that their hair is done, that they dress nicely. But then at the same time, if you're the woman that's always wearing the 4-inch heels, and you know, and you have the 3-inch nails and the lash extensions, you know, your day to day, and the hair blowout and the 2-hour makeup routine, you know, society also looks down on those women. And so that's why it's called the Goldilocks dilemma. So I have 2 cute videos from you know, former TV shows that I think kind of make this point. The first one is a song from the TV show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. And it's really making fun of this idea, like, we talk about makeovers and you know, and focusing on your appearance as being something that you do for yourself, but really you're doing it for others. You know, that there is this relationship to, you know, wanting to get social approval, social rewards, that a lot of these beauty standards, when we are in the midst of upholding them, they are rarely truly pleasurable in and of themselves. Like, I don't really know, I mean, does anyone love to get waxed? So it really just pokes fun at that concept of, you know, we put these beauty ideals out there, and then we define them as something that women should do, but then we also make it seem like women should be doing it for themselves, ignoring kind of the, you know, the social pressure to uphold those standards. And that similar kind of poking fun tone is also there in the second video, which is from Amy Schumer's former television show. And it's making fun of that song by One Direction, That's What Makes You Beautiful. But it's called Girl, You Don't Need Makeup. And I don't want to ruin the twist of that one, but I think if you watch it, you kind of get the point about, once again, these contradictory messages that we tell, particularly women, around, you know, their beauty standards. Now, moving away from, you know, beauty in terms of makeup and face, and talking a little bit more about body, that Barbie body, that curvy, impossible dimensions body, you know, it still exists today, even though women have moved further and further away from that. Women are shorter, heavier, and have very different dimensions than the Barbie body. And so, you know, to go along with that little infographic about how Barbie compares to real women, I suggest you check out this video that kind of shows what a doll would look like if she had the average woman's proportions. And just consider, what the consequences would be, if that was the doll that we put out in the general public versus the Barbie with her impossible body that little girls instead kind of grow up playing with. And so another kind of graph just showing, if we move away from Barbie to actual women, but women who are not the norm, the fashion models and the Playboy playmates. Once again, what is put out there as the ideal woman in a lot of media does not align with women's actual bodies. And the Dove Real Beauty campaign, which kind of built upon the Victoria's Secret Love My Body campaign. But it's like, why wouldn't you love your body if like first of all, their bodies are almost all the exact same, tall and thin with curves in the right places, and they vary in skin tones, but there isn't a lot of body diversity there, and those women aren't necessarily the type of women that have received messages that they shouldn't love their body. So I imagine it would be an easy body to love. Dove Real Beauty campaign, which tried to add a lot more body diversity, height, weight, weight distribution. It was meant to kind of address the fact that people need to love their real bodies, as well. And we won't even say real bodies, we'll just say more common bodies. Because what we do know is there are consequences to being bombarded, by these standards that might be difficult, if not impossible, for people to meet. So, beauty does take its toll, whether it's in the form of eating disorders, which, there's anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and then just what we generally just call disordered eating. You can kind of see those numbers there. If you're just talking about diet culture, 84% of women have dieted at some point in their adult lifetime. Female college students, 20% have starved themselves at some point to lose weight. And this is significant percentages. And also just abnormal behavior. So a person that has body dysmorphic disorder, they are constantly judging their body. They're harsh. They characterize their body in ways that are not true and accurate, but they feel true and accurate to them. So even though this is not the same thing as an eating disorder, just that kind of being constantly unhappy and dissatisfied with how you look, with how your body looks, is still problematic. Another kind of abnormal behavior that has come into focus in recent years are, women who buy and then apply excessive amounts of makeup. Does anyone really need a 17-step routine that they spend 2.5 hours on every single day? Or, they have to put on their full face before they go out in the world. That is the type of abnormal behavior that Wolf says arises in a culture that is obsessed with that beauty myth. And none of this, of course, speaks to, extreme alteration of body. The stigma around plastic surgery has dramatically faded in the last 3 or 4 decades. And plastic surgery has become a lot more common than it has in the past. And the most common surgery is liposuction, breast augmentation, and eyelid surgery. Primarily, that is popular with Asian American populations. All of that just kind of speaks to, people's attitude is if I don't like this part of my body, I can just get it fixed. And the fix that they are often looking for is a fix that makes them more in line with those images that they see in the media: bigger, perkier breast, round, the Brazilian, butt lift type of thing. That surgery has become a lot more popular recently because of the increased societal emphasis on the buttocks. So, you know, all of this just kind of speaks to all the energy and effort and resources being focused on something that is admittedly fleeting and superficial. Now, I've been speaking about this in gendered terms as if this largely only applies to women, and it's not true. There are standards of beauty for men today. They are less rigid than they are for women, largely just because women themselves are less homogeneous in terms of what they say the ideal man should look like, except for height. There's at least in the United States, there's still a very strong height preference. But you know, build and that type of thing isn't quite as standardized as it is for women. But there are standards for men today, and we are seeing increasing numbers of eating disorders in men, increasing numbers of what we call muscle dysmorphia, which is the sense that, you know, your muscles, you need to be bigger and stronger and build more muscles. And the concept I want you to relate with muscle dysmorphia is called the Adonis Complex. Is the idea that men feel like there is this perfect muscular body out there that they just need to keep working towards, that is an ideal goal, and they work towards that by, you know, counting their macros and lifting heavy and spending just unbelievable amounts of time in the gym. Now, admittedly, the discrepancy that we see, you know, so we do know that there are these standards for men. We do know it impacts them. We know that they do care about those standards to some extent. Most survey data suggests they care less than women. Although, you know, I'm always very quick to admit that what we also might be tapping into is that men might be less open about body insecurities than women. And that's just because of, you know, we encourage men to be less open about everything. That's part of the hegemonic masculine ideal, right? To be the strong, silent, tough, you know, keep your problems to yourself type. So, you know, there probably are some gaps in the data in regard to this topic. But moving beyond how individual men might be responding to the to standards of beauty and fitness related to them, just on a larger societal structural level, the beauty myth contributes to male dominance. Because it channels women's energies towards the pursuit of beauty. It might subtly encourage men to care about their appearance, but it overtly encourages women to care about their appearance and to be evaluated in regards to their appearance. It creates the space where it is expected that women will be evaluated in regards to their appearance in ways that men aren't. Just think about how the looks of women in industries and occupations that really have nothing to do with their looks, like athletics and politics, how often their looks will come up. Right? It's one thing to talk about the looks of an actress because you would be like, okay, well, that's relevant and pertinent. But you know how often people kind of debate the attractiveness of, you know, their teachers, female politicians, you know, the people on the news anchors. You know, it's much more so for women than for men. I mean, so this does take an emotional toll on women who fail to achieve ideal beauty. And so I don't think it's just a matter of not having good data. You know, I do think because the messaging in society is much more directed towards women and more overt, that the average woman does probably feel worse about her looks than the average man does, because society has been set up in such a way to make that so. And whether that's her face, her age, her body, you know, that sense of dissatisfaction. And so, you know, this is problematic because of course it diminishes, you know, women's self-worth and self-esteem. It might lead them to be unfairly discriminated and against in some settings. It might lead to people being biased and in their evaluations of them, in regards to something like beauty that should have nothing to do uh, with their performance at work or at school. Um, and as we've already noted, the rigidity of the ideal is made worse by the fact that achieving that ideal is just impossible for so many women. Their race, their ethnicity, their class, their sexual orientation, whether or not they have a physical disability, all of these aspects of women's identity beyond their gender can make the beauty myth, the beauty ideal, harder for them to uphold, in some cases, maybe even impossible for them to uphold. So they're literally being evaluated by an ideal, a standard that they just cannot meet. But still, moving away from beauty, if women are able to do masculinity and they have more behavioral freedom than men, why are they then still considered disadvantaged to men? Because that sounds like a real advantage, right? Being able to do both masculinity and femininity with a certain amount of freedom. Well, that's because of the relations of inequality that the previous chapter addressed. And so if you remember, the three relations of inequality are sexism, androcentrism, and subordination. And so all three of them pop back up in this chapter in order to help explain why women are still disadvantaged to men compared to men, even though they have that greater behavioral freedom. So the first relation of inequality, sexism, your book just addresses that really simply. Femaleness is always a possible source of prejudice. And they talk about several examples. So they talk about the orchestra example and how, there was the sense that women were being discriminated against in their orchestra assignments. But it wasn't until they switched to blind auditions and then later blind and barefoot auditions that they realized how many people were allowing their perception of gender to influence who they thought deserved to be first chair in the orchestra. The science student example that was discussed in a previous chapter, where they talked about how male and female professors, when given identical resumes of science students, and the only thing that was changed was their sex, how they rated the male students higher in competence, higher ability, and mentoring ability to be mentored. If you were to read the study, they also recommended higher starting salaries for the male students. And like I said, these weren't real, students. These were identical resumes where the only thing that had been changed was the name. And so by just changing it from a female name to a male name, there were all these increases in perceptions of positive characteristics. Another example of how sexism exists and results in inequality in a modified patriarchy is when you look at professor evaluations. And of course, as a professor, this topic is near and dear to my heart. So I give you the link if you want to check this out for yourself. But basically, when studying professor evaluations, they noticed that a lot of the language that students use to describe and evaluate their professors appeared to have a real gender dynamic. So just a few trends to note. First of all, in terms of physical appearance, while both men and women were discussed as being hot, women were much more likely to be discussed in terms of ugliness. So just going back to that beauty standard, and this is what I was talking about, how when women fail to uphold that, the social repercussions can be a lot higher than men failing to uphold that. So students were much more likely to note their female professors' lack of attractiveness than they were their male professors. Disorganization. So, if you have a professor that, had a disorganized desk, or, wasn't very neat, or, wrote sloppy, all of those were things that students were more likely to note negatively for women more so than men. And then in terms of emotional labor, the politics of being nice. A nice male professor resulted in a huge bump in terms of positive evaluation, but women were most likely to be negatively evaluated if they weren't sufficiently nice. And although being nice did make them a little bit more higher rated, than their female counterparts who weren't, it wasn't the same level of bump that male professors received. And so in addition to this, I show you the charts for how, just in terms of genius, men were more likely to be rated as genius, men were more likely to be rated as described as brilliant and cool. As you can see, hot was a little bit of a mixed bag, and as well as funny. And they said that, clearly some of this seemed to just be a gendered aspect of subjectively, who students just associate with those terms, right? That if we look at some of those terms, cool, funny, genius, if we look at those terms through gender binary glasses, who do we associate those terms with? We don't associate them with femininity and women. So then the second relation of inequality. This was androcentrism, and we've already kind of talked about this. So we'll return to our discussion about how femininity is disparaged relative to masculinity. So the feminine apologetic requires women to perform to a certain degree a devalued identity. If you can't risk being overly masculine, and you have to do femininity to a degree, but femininity is largely devalued in a lot of context in society, basically you're being required to sign on to your own devaluation, right? Whether that's pretending to be not as smart as you are, whether it's having to pretend to be nicer than you are so you don't get negative evaluations from students, whether it means, having to be flirty, or having to focus on, uh, looking a certain way, even if it has nothing to do with your job description or your day-to-day activities. All of that is a requirement of the feminine apologetic. And so, as your book notes, because power is gendered, the requirement to do femininity is also the requirement to do the powerlessness, passivity, deference, submission, fragility, and weakness, right? If you don't do any of those things in any context, think about the names that society, particularly men in society, but also probably some women as well, think about the names that they would call you if you were always bold and overt and blatant and blunt and strong and dominant and aggressive. All those traits that sound so good in men, when in women and not offset by any feminine traits, usually there isn't the same societal admiration. Instead, there becomes some societal pushback. And so this all relates to the concept of doing gender, right? That you are actively having to do some aspects of the gender role and gender expression, and be strategic about it, because you're trying to maximize societal reward and diminish the amount of societal punishment that would be headed your way. And so just an example of how even commercials meant to be, uplifting for young women, young girls, how they can kind of fall in this androcentrism trap. The first one is for a company called Goldie Blocks. And they had a whole series of commercials, what they said, like pushing back against the princess machine. But the thing about the commercials, especially their original commercial, was it established this dichotomy between the princess girls and the Goldilocks girls, who were seen as being less feminine, but cooler, smarter, because they were into engineering and building things. And the princess girls were just seen as jumping around dressed in their princess dresses. So kind of by setting up that comparison, they're kind of, shitting on the princess girls, excuse my language. And androcentrism is behind that. The idea that one is better than the other, as opposed to just saying, in a perfect world, we should have space where there can be both types of girls, or girls can be either or. Much cooler commercial, I think, would have been the princess girls also doing some of the cool engineering, robotic, Goldilocks activities while dressed in their princess dresses, right? That's a very different message. Similar, but not quite as bad as the Verizon commercial, what she hears when you call her pretty. This really speaks to a false dichotomy that young girls can hear growing up, that you're pretty or you're smart. And pretty is associated with, femininity, dresses and dolls, and caring about your appearance, and not wanting to get dirty, and superficial things. And smart, of course, is smart, interested in deeper things, and being academically curious, and so forth. It's kind of that same false dichotomy as, being a princess girl versus a Goldilocks girl. Why can't you be pretty and smart? Why do we set it up like it's one or the other? And then in this contemporary society, because this certainly wouldn't have always been the case, but in this contemporary society, when you set up that dichotomy, you're pretty or smart, you're a Goldilocks girl or you're a princess girl. These commercials make it sound like the obvious choice is to be the Goldilocks girl, or to emphasize that someone is smart. But in reality, of course, it's a lot more complicated than that, because women are required to do that balance. And those beauty standards do exist. And so, no matter how smart you are, you can't necessarily escape the possible social consequences of ignoring contemporary beauty standards. And really, that is why there is no hegemonic femininity like there is hegemonic masculinity. There isn't just one ideal way of being a woman that everyone would want to be. For one thing, as your book notes, it's because unlike the hegemonic man, who even women are supposed to look up to and aspire to, or aspire to some of his traits, that isn't the case for women, because men aren't supposed to look up to women and aspire to their feminine traits. So there is no hegemonic femininity, because women are not put out there as the ideal person. Feminine traits aren't put out as being the ideal traits in society. But then even amongst women themselves, there's no dominant kind of version of femininity right now, because women are striking their own individuated balances of masculine feminine traits, trying to uphold that modern Barbie rule. And so this brings us to the last relation of inequality, which is subordination. And so the requirement to do femininity is also the requirement to do subordination. Subordination is about never bothering others with one's own discomfort or concerns. And your book gives the examples of the popularity of Botox to erase RBF, resting bitch face, because you don't even want people to think that you're walking around being unpleasant and unhappy, as well as the example of giving birth like a girl, which means, I guess, keeping in mind that there are other people in the hallway that are sharing walls with you, and trying, not to be loud and unpleasant so as to not bother them. To do femininity is to do deference, and to do deference is to do femininity. Deference is, if you think about those gender binary glasses, deference is a feminine trait. And so your book notes how, the original voices, before they started allowing, you to have multiple options, but the original voices of assisted technology, like Siri as well as Alexa, those were feminine voices, right? Because assistant technology, what is the purpose of it? It's there to help. And who in life is meant to be there to help? It's women. And so, what does this look like? This doing deference. Your book mentions it's, being touched, being the person that, someone touches your back when they say, excuse me, or they grab your arm to say, oh, squeezing through, right? Because when you are the subordinate in these power relations, you're dominant. Person does not have to worry about respecting your space to the same extent as they would with another dominant person. Not initiating or holding sustained eye contact, smiling, hedging, which is a verbal thing, right? Instead of stating what you think outright, you might say things like, I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, but I don't know if this is the answer. I'm not sure if this is right, but all of those are verbal hedges, and women are as well as people who are subordinate in situations are more likely to engage in that behavior. Hyper politeness, lots of excuse me's, I'm sorry's, and then questions in response to questions. So your textbook notes that these behaviors are exhibited by people in subordinate positions relative to others. And the reason why so many women exhibit these behaviors is because of their general subordinate position in society. So you'll see men exhibiting these behaviors when they are in established subordinate positions, whether it's being the kid that gets picked on in school, or low man of the totem pole in your fraternity or organization, or later maybe even in your office or job or construction site. But for a lot of women, because their societal position is subordinate, these are behaviors that they subconsciously do, like they don't even think about it, too much anymore. If you're a woman, maybe consider, how often you do some of those things, or how often some of these things are done to you. People touching you without your permission, like in public spaces, people not getting out of your way off the sidewalk. How often do you hedge or exhibit hyper politeness? I'm sorry, excuse me, whatever in your verbal communication. What happens if you go around all day without smiling? And if you start being aware of those types of behaviors, I know that for myself, when I became more aware of those types of behaviors, I noticed that I engaged in them a lot more frequently than I thought. And so we have this conclusion. Women then have more freedom than men to do gender as they like. They can do both masculinity and femininity. There is a carrot and a stick, however, a benevolent and hostile sexism. Both doing and not doing femininity can be dangerous. All right, so this part of our chapter introduces us to these additional new concepts, benevolent and hostile sexism, and how they both work in conjunction with one another to make women do femininity to some extent, even if they are not so naturally inclined to do so. So let's talk about those. So what is benevolent sexism versus hostile sexism? So benevolent sexism is kind of the beliefs and ideas that people can have in society, that women should be treated a certain way or shouldn't do certain things because of their supposed natural dispositions, innate dispositions as a woman. And the reason why this is sexist is, of course, we've already kind of established that a lot of these supposed innate natural differences don't exist. So when people attribute positive traits to women that then justify them being treated in a way that is subordinate to men, they're engaging in benevolent sexism. right? And so some of those traits that people will then use to justify women's subordination are traits like supportive, loving, patient, kind, and they sound good on their face, but it becomes kind of like, oh, well, you're too kind-hearted to make tough hiring decisions. I can't imagine someone as sweet as you being able to fire someone. So, that's why you didn't get the position, Sheila, and we gave it to Brad, right? Um, it's taking sexism. It's taking this idea that you're innately different from men, and not just innately different but inferior in some ways, and it's couching it in terms that makes it sound like you're superior or even equal in some aspects, but then you're using those same traits to kind of justify um, the subordinate position in society, why women are not dominant, why aren't more women in politics, why aren't women more women heads of companies. If you're using those supposedly positive traits that are actually perceived in society as being subordinate to the more dominant traits held by men as a justification for women's subordinate position, then that is what benevolent sexism looks like. Hostile sexism is the one that students are usually more familiar with. This is the type of sexism where you believe women are inferior and you express it in such a way that you are threatening them. Whether that means you are verbally harassing them or even, physically assaulting them, engaging upon some type of like physical violence, that is hostile sexism. Now, you might say, well, benevolent sexism seems a lot better than hostile sexism. Your textbook, though, really wants you to think of these as two sides of the same coin, because benevolent sexism requires women to display subservience. And as long as you do that, the reward is going to be men's approval, protection, support. To a certain extent, we call this chivalry. But if you don't display this subservience, what you're risking from some men in some contexts is outright hostile sexism. So, think about it. If a guy shouts out at you, you're too pretty to not smile, that's benevolent sexism. If you smile back and he is like, looking good, beautiful, by complying with that benevolent sexism, you receive that societal reward. Now, if instead of smiling when he makes that comment, you frown further, or you roll your eyes and ignore him, or maybe, even flip him off, now what you're risking is that benevolent sexism turning into something more hostile. Maybe he calls you a bitch or a cunt, or maybe he even then starts following you for a few blocks, making threatening comments. I give that example because it happened once to me. So yeah, I'm well aware, and I'm sure I'm not the only person that has a story that shows, how very easily that switch can be flipped, where benevolent sexism, if you don't provide the right subservient, submissive response, can easily become hostile sexism. And so this is what your book means on page 173 when it says benevolence isn't a kindness, it is a trap. Because what it does is it positions men as both the savior protector as well as the threat danger. And the thing is you don't necessarily know what to do and who to trust, because it isn't just some men are savior protectors and some men are threats and dangers. It's the idea that the same man can easily move from being a savior protector into a threat danger based on his perception of you, of your level of subservience, of your level of vulnerability, and how you respond to him. And so all of this just relates back to power relations. And so I just want to recall, we discussed the hierarchy of masculinity model in the last chapter. And I want to introduce the other element of it, because the person who made this model, McConnell, You know, she talked about how, you know, it's men who conform to hegemonic masculinity at the top, and then men who practice complicit masculinity, and then marginalized men, and then subordinate men. But she also adds women to the mix, and we didn't discuss that in the last chapter. She adds women to the mix because women also can be part of this masculinity model. Now, for her, women could potentially have statuses like social class that would make them able to uh, uphold some elements of hegemonic masculinity and enjoy social status and protections that might even place them above, uh, you know, men who are marginalized or men who are subordinate. But for women who are not able to um, to exemplify this hegemonic masculine ideal, for women who don't have other social identities that give them power and privilege, for those women, they find themselves at the bottom of the pyramid, competing for space and resources and respect, along with the marginalized men and the subordinate men. And that is why oftentimes it's not necessarily the men at the top of the pyramid who are most likely to engage in hostile sexism in particular. Sometimes it's the men who aren't even really benefiting much from this pyramid of masculinity, who are most adamant about calling out and being hostile to women. And that's the point that your book makes when they give that gamer example. That it was the gamers that had the least status, that were most likely to engage in kind of sexist uh, insults and harassment uh, to female gamers. And that brings us to our discussion about why being a woman is dangerous. So we talked about gendered violence last chapter with men in our discussion of hypermasculinity and toxic masculinity. We're going to build on that discussion now to kind of think about it from the woman's perspective, which is much more likely to be the perspective of the victim survivor than the perpetrator. And just, you know, to kind of give you an extent of what that distinction looks like. You know, if you're talking about women who've been killed by their intimate partners, 2.5% of men have been killed by their intimate partner of this opposite sex, versus 34% of total female homicide victims. So meaning about 1/3 of female victims of homicide in a 9-year period were killed by their heterosexual intimate partner. So someone not just who they knew, but someone who they knew and loved or used to love or thought they loved. Um, and male comparison is much lower, and that shouldn't be very surprising, because as we established when we talked about hypermasculinity and toxic masculinity, the vast majority of violent crime is committed by men, whether you're talking armed robberies, whether you're talking aggravated assaults, whether you're talking murder. There is this stalking, there is this gendered aspect when it comes to violence. And so what we see is that men are more likely to be victims, but it's because they're more likely to be victims of male on male violence. Male on female violence is the next most common form of violence. And this is the form of violence that your textbook discusses in greater detail, talking about misogynistic murder, which is what happens when men experience aggrieved, or what is also referred to as thwarted entitlement, the sense that, you know, women owe them a certain amount of deference and submission, and when they don't receive that, and they then murder that woman. We define that as being a misogynistic murder. And sometimes this is a man who is a former intimate partner, current intimate partner, and sometimes, like in the case of Elliot Rogers, it's just a man who is targeting random women, not even necessarily women that he knows. Female on male murder is much less common, or female on male violence is much less common, especially if you're talking about extreme forms of violence like murder. Um, we'll talk a little bit more about other types of violence in a second. And these rates have actually diminished in the last 3 to 4 decades as it has become easier, and there are more resources available for women to leave relationships characterized by intimate partner violence. In the 70s, 60s, and 70s, up until the early 80s, when there were no laws against marital rape, when most domestic violence was underreported and then, under um, under legislated, I guess. Some of these murders of men at the hands of their female counterparts were due to the fact of what we call violent retaliation. That at some point, if your female partner had been the victim of ongoing abuse, they would eventually violently retaliate and kill the male partner. And we've seen those types of murders. We've seen them go down in the last few decades as we've had changes in divorce laws, and we've had changes in the level of resources that are provided to people who are fleeing those types of situations. So, an increased number of domestic shelters, women's shelters, domestic abuse shelters, and those types of resources. And then female on female violence. Being kind of the most rare form of gender violence. So let's talk a little bit more about intimate partner violence. The term we used to use was domestic violence. We now use intimate partner violence because it's a broader term. It captures people that have never shared a home and don't share a child. So, it captures dating violence, for instance, and former boyfriends and girlfriends who've never lived together. When we talk about this type of violence, we can characterize it in terms of three types of behavior: emotional, physical, and sexual. Now, this is where, of course, our data becomes very dicey because it's not like we have very good data on emotional violence. And there seems to be at least some research that suggests that there is much more gender parity in this form of violence than the other two. Physical violence and sexual violence are similar in the sense that some of these behaviors are uh, less likely to be noticed, observed, and reported to the police. So we aren't going to have the same level of data for, scratching and pinching someone as we have for like punching and choking someone, especially if it resulted in a police call. Same thing with sexual, right? Even though rape is underreported, someone using sexual manipulation or pressuring you to have sex or embarrassing sexual comments, those types of behaviors are virtually never reported to the police. So I acknowledge up front that, some of our observations are going to be limited by the fact at the lower level of physical and sexual, we don't have good data, and we don't have good data about emotional violence at all. But what we do have data for, the more severe forms of physical and sexual violence, obviously it suggests that men are more likely to be perpetrators of this than women. The prevalence of this type of violence has decreased since the 1970s, but it has decreased much more so on the end of women. And I've already kind of explained how we've seen a diminishing number of women engaging in what we call violent retaliation against their abusive partners. Instead, they now have the ability, they now have more of the ability to leave with more resources than they did previously. So when we're talking about violence, defining what that violence looks like, what it consists of, helps us make more sense of it. So one type of violent relationship is what we call the situational partner violence. This is the type of violence where this is a couple where, you know, they're always yelling at one another, insulting one another, you know, shoves, maybe slaps or pinches. It never seems to escalate to severe levels of violence, but it also seems to be ongoing and consistent. And the thing is, if a couple is in situational partner violence, that can just be the nature of their relationship. Now, I'm not saying that that's a good relationship or a healthy thing, because I don't think it is, and it is not. But what I'm saying is that just because someone has a relationship that is characterized by situational partner violence doesn't mean that it necessarily is going to become what we call intimate terrorism, which is much more intense and severe in its levels of violence as well as in its consequences. And I will talk about it more on the next slide. But before I do, I just want to say that there is another form of intimate partner violence that has become more prevalent than it has in the past, and that's what we call family annihilators. This is a violent act where you don't just kill your intimate partner, but you kill your dependent children, and you also sometimes commit suicide. When this happens, it is more likely to be men, which isn't to say that women never engage in this type of act, because I can certainly think of a couple of situations from the last few years where I read news stories about women, you know, killing their children, killing their partner. But like our other forms of severe violence, this is more likely to be have a male perpetrator. Which brings me now to the cycle of abuse, which is a cycle of abuse used to be called the battered woman syndrome. And this is much more likely to be a characteristic of the intimate terrorism, where you have persistent, regular, violent acts perpetuated against you by your intimate partner. And those violent acts become increasingly more severe over time. So the cycle of abuse looks a little bit like this. It begins with the tension building phase. Criticism increases. Your partner is unhappy, and they're lashing out at you verbally. They perhaps yell, they swear, they're just very angry. And at some point, they reach their explosion point, which is also referred to as the cute battering incident. It can be one time, or it can be multiple times within this given period. But this is the part where the violence happens. Usually it's physical or sexual, not just emotional at this point. After this phase, you then enter the honeymoon period, also called the calm. During this phase, there are apologies, there are promises, maybe there are gifts, they take you on vacation. But at some point, this phase ends and you're back at the tension building phase. Now, the thing about the cycle of abuse in intimate terrorist relationships is that this is a repeated pattern. It's not a one-time thing. And what happens is that the explosion, the acute battering incident, becomes increasingly worse. Shoves become slaps, become closed-fisted punches, becomes choking. And the honeymoon period becomes shorter. And it becomes less characterized by apologies and gifts and promises, and more characterized by blaming, like, why do you make me so angry? Why do you make me hurt you like that? Because at this point, what your intimate partner is no longer afraid of is the person leaving. And they no longer feel like they have to grovel and apologize to the same degree. Now, the reason why that this cycle of abuse used to be called the battered woman syndrome isn't just because they imagined it only was relevant to women, but really it was because, as I said, violent retaliation rates used to be a lot higher. And that was when women who had abusive partners would violently retaliate, murder them. Now, what is important for most state self-defense laws is when that murder would take place. Now, if that murder would have taken place in the explosion, acute battering incident, in the midst of them being physically attacked and harmed, then those women would have been protected by self-protection, self-defense laws in most states. but because of the difference in size and strength in a lot of heterosexual partnerships, what was found was that for a lot of these incidents, the violent retaliation took place in the tension building phase. So women were not necessarily in imminent danger of harm the way a lot of self-defense laws are set up, to protect you in that moment. Instead, what it often looked like in paper was, that this was premeditated, and this was true, especially if you did not take into account, whether or not there had been this history of abuse in this cycle. So when the psychologists introduced this theory, battered women syndrome kind of model, it helped provide a better defense for women who were facing, these, murder charges on the basis of their violent retaliation, because it helped make sense why these murders were happening during the tension building phase and not necessarily during the explosion phase. Now, oftentimes when I would teach this material and would emphasize that women, would stay through these relationships through multiple cycles, there would always be people that would wonder, why do they stay? And while I think this is a question that people are curious to ask, this question also is very victim blamey, right? Because there are a lot of reasons why these women stay, related to self-esteem, related to actual financial need, related to their children, in some cases fear, because, in the year and a half after you leave your abuser, that's actually the most dangerous time period. They are more likely to kill you during that time period than when you were actually together. Oftentimes they had been isolated, they felt shame, they felt guilt. So, I give you an article that kind of highlights why women stay. And this was in reference to the hashtag that went viral, hashtag why I stayed. And I give you that infographic that provides you just some kind of numbers about just how viral, how important, how much that hashtag resonated with so many people. Before we leave our discussion about, why the world is so violent for women behind, I want to briefly touch on rape. I'll come back to this topic when we get to the sexuality chapter. But, in the same way that intimate partner violence, is real and blurs that line between, the men you can trust and the men you cannot. What we know about rape is something similar, because for the 18% of women who've experienced rape, and I'll come back to men in a second, but for the 18% of women who've experienced rape, which is a little under 1 out of 5, or, so that's a significant amount. Most of those women experienced, rape at the hands of an intimate partner, or former intimate partner, an acquaintance, a family member, much more likely than stranger, even though, of course, that's what we grew up being taught to be afraid of course, is the stranger in the bushes, stranger danger. And I like to just emphasize this intimate partner, acquaintance, and family member, because it goes back to how, benevolent sexism is that double-edged sword, because it puts men in the role of both being protector as well as threat. And it's not always clear about which one an individual is. Now, in the same way that we don't necessarily have good data about men's body satisfaction, we probably also don't have very good data about men's sexual assault experiences. Based on the same survey, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, only 1% of men have been raped at some point in their lives, with the majority of those men indicating it happened when they were boys, prepubescent, and within the context of their families or close family friends. And so, at least based on this data, rape for men is much rarer in adulthood outside of the context of imprisonment, where in which in that context it's much more common. So much so, laws have been passed, PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act. But, if that 1%, in the same way that we talk about the reasons why men might underreport body dissatisfaction, I think it's quite clear that men are probably underreporting their experiences with sexual assault and rape, whether it happened to them as a child or even as an adult, because to be assaulted and violated in that way really strikes at that hegemonic masculine ideal, because if the whole thing about being the hegemonic man is to be dominant, being raped is literally, perceptually the opposite of that. So getting men to open up and be honest about those experiences has proven to be difficult. I'm going the wrong way, class. It took me several slides to figure that out. The last point I want to make about gender before I leave, or gender violence, is, thinking beyond heterosexual, men, women. We don't know as much as we should about the gender violence that occurs outside of that context. And part of that's because it took us a very long time to even get data, to even have the resources to study the violence that occurs in heterosexual partnerships. So, the violence that occurs in lesbian, gay, relationships, partnerships, it has been much, it has been very much understudied. And so this is kind of a growing field of research. The limited research that we have on it, of course, does suggest that, it does occur, and it is much less likely to be reported than the IPV that happens in heterosexual relationships. But if you're going to talk about gender violence, in addition to IPV, you also have to note that there's hate-fueled violence that makes life particularly dangerous for effeminate or gay men, so particularly gay men who's in terms of gender expression are more effeminate, as well as transgender women. Those populations are particularly vulnerable for physical assaults, harassment, and even murder, particularly, once again, transgender women. I give you a link to a CNN article that discusses just the trends of transgender deaths in the United States. And I will say that, a year later, those trend lines look just as bad. This continues to be a very serious issue in our society. And so, after discussing why the world is such a dangerous place for women, your book does talk about, how women respond to this. And one kind of response that the authors note is what they call mismanaging harm. And they describe this by saying that when women set out to manage the violence that they expect or experience from men, they sometimes engage in self-harm or victim blaming. And of course, victim blaming is what it sounds like, right? When you blame the victim of a crime for their own crime, the crime that was perpetuated against them. whether it's, you asking, why they were there, what were they wearing, what were they doing, but just that focus that they somehow could have avoided being the victim of a crime, as opposed to emphasizing and placing the blame where it should belong, which is with the perpetrator. So, your book discusses why women blame the victim, as well as men. And for women, the motivation is usually different than for men. But by blaming the victim, it allows women to divide women into those who are and aren't smart enough to protect themselves from violence. And it provides a false sense of security. Of course, one, really sad consequence of this victim blaming at the hands of women is it undermines solidarity around the issue of violence, gendered violence. And of course, your book just notes that, this really is just a double bind because, if you're vulnerable and deferential in society, you're perceived as being easy prey. But if you're self-assertive and non-deferential, you risk being a pariah and then experiencing hostile sexism. So you still wind up being potentially victimized. So, there is no safe strategy here. And even if, you did not go around being either one of those things and you just were like, hey, I'm going to just try to stick in the middle and be neutral. As they explain, women's bodies in the West are socially constructed as being fragile and inherently vulnerable. We're depicted and described as being weaker than men, as being less strong than men, as being less courageous, as being less violent. And so even if you didn't go around being, openly deferential or openly non-deferential, just someone seeing your female body could lead them to make this conclusion that you are an easy prey, easy victim, just because of how we conceptualize female bodies. And so, your book gives some really interesting examples, I think, about how, different self-defense programs and such try to teach women to reimagine themselves as loud, strong, angry, and dangerous. Because, evidence does show, a lot of potential crimes can be stopped by fighting back, by being loud, by getting angry. But learning how to do this, feeling comfortable doing this, is what your book describes as being a compensatory gender strategy, right? You have to learn how to do it because you have to compensate for the gendered messages that you've received that you shouldn't do it. And so we have that quote from page 178 that women, like men, make patriarchal bargains to maximize their autonomy, safety, and well-being in the face of sexism, androcentrism, and subordination. So after your book kind of established, like, look, this is what women are dealing with. They're in this precarious position, where they're expected to do femininity and masculinity. They face benevolent and hostile sexism. It's a carrot and a stick, but either way, it's kind of keeping them trapped in these relations of inequality. The chapter ends by discussing, so how does the average woman respond? What does she do? Well, in the same way that we talked about men making patriarchal bargains, we have women making patriarchal bargains in this modified patriarchy. And the three types of bargains that your book talks about are emphasize femininity, emphatic sameness, and gender equivocation. So emphasize femininity. The examples they give here are your stay-at-home moms, as well as, gold diggers, beautiful companions. But basically, you're just doing that emphasize femininity where, you either are the dream homemaker or the ideal beautiful companion. Because it's this idea that if you are doing femininity to this degree, this deferential femininity, that men will reward you. So you're doing this to get rewards from the men in your life. Of course, the risk is you can't really control the reward being offered, how much it is, how long it'll last. It can all go away in a moment. You can get replaced with a younger, newer model, and that's happened to stay-at-home moms as well as gold diggers, beautiful companions. And so some women go in the opposite direction. They go with emphatic sameness, where they de-emphasize femininity, instead emphasizing that they are just like their male colleagues or peers. And so your book notes that, first of all, emphatic sameness is only possible in some contexts. And those are the contexts that really idealize and prioritize some aspects of masculinity. Because in other contexts, in most contexts, the expectation is that women can't overdo masculinity or they're going to risk being a pariah. But your book notes that even in these contexts, like they specifically highlight the military, for instance. But even in these contexts where you're like, I can do as many push-ups and pull-ups as you can. If you shave your head, I'll shave my head. I'm going to work just as hard as you. They say, first of all, they have to still, they risk being labeled a pariah regardless, especially if they don't find some way to at least hint at their femininity, whether it's making it clear that they're heterosexual or, at least spending a little bit more time and energy on their appearance. Even in these contexts, they can perhaps overdo it. But then the other issue with this bargain is that it is a limited individual bargain, and it's dependent on like the general denigration of femininity. So you're basically are just saying like, yeah, being feminine is it sucks. It's weak. It's not admirable. So I'm not going to do this thing. So basically you're placing yourself above all other women. You're poo-pooing femininity and super embracing masculinity. And so, yeah, you're getting ahead, but you're kind of setting up a false dichotomy where you are superior and different from all other women. Thus, you're participating in the devaluing of other women. And the final bargain, which is one they say most women make in most contexts, is what's called gender equivocation. You're just constantly alternating between masculinity and femininity, constantly searching, trying to find that perfect balance that will result in you maximizing your societal reward and minimizing your societal, punishment. And so it's a double bind in a lot of cases, that you're doing this gender equivocating and you're constantly risking being gauged as being either too masculine or too feminine. And your book gives you several examples, from both athletics and politics, about the consequences of being considered, of being evaluated, and it being determined that you aren't doing the balance as well as society would like. And so we get to our quote from 184. Women, like men, make patriarchal bargains to maximize their autonomy and well-being. Men face substantially tighter restrictions than women, but the bargains available to them offer greater rewards. Women enjoy more flexibility, but no matter what bargain women seek to make, the outcomes are not in their favor. And so because of this, the result is what your book calls the stalled revolution. And so your book discusses this in context with feminism. And we're going to talk about feminism later in this course when we get to chapter 13. So you can skip those pages and we'll come back to those later. But I do want to emphasize the stall revolution, which is the idea that the gender revolution that was supposed to change gender relations between men and women has stalled, since the 70s, that women have made, great strides in a lot of facets in life, but have not achieved inequality. They have not been able to overcome those three relations of inequality: sexism, androcentrism, and subordination. And the goal is now that you've reached the end of chapter 7, you should be able to use the information from chapter 6 on masculinity and chapter 7 on femininity to help understand this phenomenon, that you can kind of see how, by defining hegemonic masculinity, in the way that we have, how it has led to there being a stall. It contributes to male flight. It makes men less likely to be willing to be, stay at home caretakers, supportive husbands for their perhaps higher earning wives, makes it harder for them to accept the leadership of women in business as well as politics. But then also, now that we've reached the end of chapter 7, understanding how modern femininity requires that feminine apologetic, which to a certain extent means that women have to do submission and devaluation in their gender expression and their interactions with people. All of this is contributing to that stall revolution. And so the author's analysis: men are hurt as individuals, but benefit as a collective, while women might benefit as individuals, but are harmed as a general collective. I think that's a really interesting analytical observation to just kind of spend some time with and think about, to what extent do you agree? And more importantly, if you're a man who's hurt as an individual, what can we do then to, create in that man a consciousness of how they still benefit. And likewise, for a woman, if you are a woman who individually is benefiting, is there a way to inspire that in that woman a certain level of consciousness about how all these other women are being harmed and why they should perhaps care about that? And this brings me to my final point, which leads us back in time to the chapter I skipped, which is chapter 5, because this textbook does introduce the concept of the matrix of domination, which builds upon the concept of intersectionality, which was introduced in chapter 3, right? The idea that we have all of these different identities. Well, the matrix of domination builds upon this by saying it's not just that we have multiple identities, but these identities are arranged in hierarchies. So we have placements within multiple hierarchies. So it's not just that you have a bunch of different identities, but you have a collection of oppressed and privileged identities, and your placement in these overlapping hierarchies, it does kind of shape, to what extent you're able to benefit from the hierarchy of masculinities. And this is true for both men as well as women. So going back to that question, if both men and women are constrained by a binary gender system, why is it that more women than men find this system unfair? We have that answer, right? It does relate to the fact that, there are these power relations, and that for a lot of men, even if they're not at the top of the pyramid, they are higher than most women. And that for a lot of men is sufficient, or sufficient enough for them to not want to buck this system.